voice messages received yesterday at 5:59 p.m.
Yes, mate, it's been escalated. They got in over the fucking fence. I was attacked downstairs by the same cunt with a hammer. I managed to fight him off. He's caused some damage. I'll talk to you later. I had to call cops for obvious reasons. Thank you.
To return the call, press 0. To listen to the...
Yes, thank you. I'll now break the narrative as to what I was doing. I was actually upstairs in the building working on a file. I'd been down here 10 minutes before when I heard the sound of breaking glass. Probably what I heard was that door, then I heard more breaking glass. I quickly went to an upstairs window and looked into the lane and assumed that they had come back. I then decided that I'd come downstairs, obtain some sort of non-lethal but suitable weapon to confront the offenders before any damage was done. I have a couple of those items downstairs. I ran to the top of the landing, and it was at that moment I heard the crash, which was obviously this item. I couldn't work out whether it was a crash from outside the building or inside the building, but it sounded loud, and I assumed it was possible that some items had been thrown over the fence. As I came down the stairs, reaching pretty much to here, I thought this bloke might actually be in the building. I came forward to about here, and it's at that moment I saw him. He was standing just behind there. He was a male person, about 170 centimetres tall. He was wearing some sort of greenish brown tight jacket. He had a dark coloured balaclava, either dark blue or black, I'm not exactly sure. I'd reached this point, which was just beyond where there was in fact a very helpful cricket bat, but I never got an opportunity to get back for it. He immediately saw me, and he ran straight for me, like this.
Was this where he was when he...
Yes, he came, he was standing right here,
Yep.
and he saw me and I saw him. Instantaneously, he raised the hammer and he ran straight for me, and he moved with considerable speed. Now, I was situated about here. He swung the thing at me. I managed to fall to the side. I believe it glanced me, and at that moment I hit him. Now, there's some blood to the floor here. We grappled with each other. I hit him a couple more times as best I could to his head. I had hold of his jacket. I believe that he had the hammer, and he used it not this way but that way, and he hit me a couple of times to the head with his hammer. I reasonably anticipate his hammer will have blood on it. Somehow we came through here grappling, I'm not exactly sure, trying to hit each other and gain advantage, and at that moment we both skewed onto the floor here. Now there's more blood on this floor. This item, of course, as said, was situated down there, and we were grappling at each other here. I hit him, he dropped the hammer.
None of this blood was his?
No, well, I don't believe so, but I would assume samples have been taken. He had the balaclava on. If there was blood, it's probably in his balaclava, if I had managed to cut him, which I'm unsure. The hammer went under the table. I realised by then that I was definitely bleeding, and I had a towel. There was a considerable amount of blood that was on my shirt and elsewhere. There's blood on the floor here. I realised that I was certainly bleeding.
And of course, there's blood on the wall there.
Yes, there's blood on the wall.
Well, it looks like a handprint.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that happened, to be frank. No idea. I
Well,
don't.
somebody.
It could have been me on the phone. I'm uncertain. Obviously, I rang the relevant services because of my wound. I wasn't sure how hard he'd actually injured me, but he did have this hammer. I then noticed that the hammer was under the table, and needless to say, I didn't touch it. And from what I understand, the CCTV reveals a number of things about him that may point to the fact that he may be identifiable as an offender.
It wasn't, that hammer wasn't taken from him there.
No, it was his own hammer.
He brought his own. And he brought his own milk crates.
And he brought his own
which he
milk crates.
used for the purpose of
breaking
launching
into. This is a very organised man.
But at the same time, incredibly inept.
And also inept. I understand you to be a man between 19 and 22 years of age, 170 centimetres tall. I'd say he'd probably weigh maybe 63, 64 kilos. He's reasonably fit. He's reasonably wiry. I could feel him through the jacket.
And he's definitely a terrorist, isn't he?
I'd call him a type of urban terrorist at the level of ANTIFA, certainly where politically motivated violence reaches towards
a supposition on our part, but having reviewed the footage from last week's attack, the general look of the guy.
The ambulance surveyed me, did the usual things, gave the usual advice, and for the fruits of my day I had various cuts and abrasions, which were all fine. One point I think I can make is I have been in the past, albeit a long time ago, in certain street brawls and whatever. The difference that impresses me about what occurred last night was the moment this man saw me. Rather than wave the hammer at me and make his way out of the premises, perhaps using expletives or something like that, he came to attack me. And no hesitation, no equivocation, he came to attack me.
Would you call it an assassination attempt?
Well, some people have suggested that to me. If you're a public figure and someone attempts to murder you, then yes. Did he intend to murder? Well, that's something at this stage I really don't know. But certainly if you wield an instrument like that and you go for someone's head, you may intend, possibly in your mind, to cause a grievous bodily harm or something like that. You can in fact kill someone. As the ambulance person said to me, the blow that I did receive from the hammer, albeit I believe a passing blow, I stepped away from the man as he swung and I went for his head. It seems to me that he could have achieved his objective. Had he been a little stronger, a little taller, a little fitter, I have no doubt whatsoever he would have overcome me. Whatever can be said, I might be fit for my age, but I am 65. I believe he would have overcome me. I believe he could in fact have murdered me. And it raises a number of political questions, and we'll deal with those.
Well, it does, doesn't it? Because we've been having the hyperbole of right-wing extremism and terrorism written into legislation, written, into the code. And yet, meanwhile, while our heads turned looking for a bogey, this is going on. And this has...
And in Melbourne only the other day, they sentenced a man who I consider to be a fool in need of mental health and all that for 12 years jail for an alleged terrorist plot, when he's probably been engineered into it by his own friends, one of whom is undoubtedly an agent. This is a real event of potential real terrorism. It's not made up stuff. Had he succeeded and I was grievously injured or possibly killed, then this man becomes a hero to global ANTIFA, a new palfreyman who's weaseled his way out of jail in Bulgaria. It's a situation where this man would have been an ANTIFA terrorist hero. interpretation. On this occasion, I believe it's actually correct for a collaboration with the, I'll say, criminal police over the matter, because the allegations have usually been made that it's the nationalist movement or some of these erstwhile patriots who have been actually the people engaged of late in this violence. It isn't.
What has it got on there? Open it right up. Here we go. Jim Saleam is a police informant. The man Jim Saleam is a father of our nationalism. Keyboard warrior John Dickinson, big keyboard warrior. Jordan Rat Nathan Sykes. Chris Shortis is the grumpy thumb. And we've got Tim Parrott who goes under the alias on Facebook with a pseudonym of Anthony Williams. Scooter Boy. And Tony, who can forget Tony, Eva Broad, Robinson, the DSP mistress. Isn't it, Jim, that you call yourself Australian nationalists, but your whole party's on Centrelink. Mate, I reckon this is one of the breach officers for Centrelink in Tempe. Why don't you come out and see us? You're a coward. And also, we'd like to know which country, a European country, does the surname Saleam come from? Which one? You know the truth? None. Stop the charade, stop the bully, stop the intimidation and the slander. It's going to go further again if you don't stop it, mate. We're not going to stop until you stop the online slander and ridicule. We would like you to stop it. We don't attack you. You've been attacking patriots now for many decades, and for 10 years I've had to put up with it. For 10 years I'm sick of it, Jim. I'm sick of the defamation. You're a disgrace to the movement. I think it's time for a burning. Yep. Give it a good burning there. Light it up. Light it up, yeah. Light it up, look at that, yep. There you go, Jim, there's your flag. Up in smoke, up in smoke. Up in smoke, good stuff. The thing is, has got to stop the defamation and the ridicule side of it. Everyone knows about that, everyone can research what you've done over the years, the intimidation, the hypocrisy, and the double nature of your work pretending to be a patriot when we all know that
perhaps got a theory as to why these characters that were involved in the anti-Islam milieu have suddenly gone all Adolf Hitler? Why? What?
Yes, because they live in a bifurcated fantasy world, alternating between slavish devotion to establishment norms and pseudo-radicalism. Both of their perspectives are equally vacuous. Each of them is an attempt to justify themselves or their own weakness. I think it can be more addressed in the realm of psychology, and if it has any ideological veneer at all, it's because this pseudo-fascism is always conceived in a conservative way. So they're initially conservatives, and then they're pseudo-fascists. So to me, it's just two sides of the one thing, and the key is psychology.
It's interesting too, the hypocrisy that it unveils, because at the core of the anti-Islam movement was a deference to Israel, because the Jews were enemies of the Muslims, therefore the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, that reveals something else too, doesn't it?
It does. What it means is, if one looks at it through the prism of psychology again, but with the ideological assumptions of conservatism and this pseudo-fascism put to it, is basically they're people who don't have any model for political action. They are dependent on impression. Therefore, if they can't get it, this adoration of the crowd or support in their own minds one way, they then flip to a supposed polar opposite, and they think they're going to get it from there. Again, if we look at it, we say, well, what is or what was the consistency all the way through it? It's not actually having a proper nationalist-based program.
Laser hunting will be last in all seats across the country, except in a very small number of seats like Lindsay, where Jim Saleam, for example, is running, and where the judgment is made that he's an even worse candidate with a even more atrocious record, which justifies putting him even further behind.
Jim Saleam is the same at this. Australia First is a honey trap as well. That many people have fallen around Jim Saleam, gone to prison for many years. I've spoken to a few ex-Nazis since I come out as a patriot and nationalist now, that have told me they spent years in jail for these scumbags as well. These people are informants for federal police. Jim Saleam, he pretty much rated out everyone in national action.
There you go, patriots. Now I'm just going to do a quick video on the Jews. Why not? Now I'm going to be talking about the Jews for a bit. Hopefully I can get it under a couple of minutes. I've seen some patriots I know, some very high profile patriots sharing conspiracy theories about the Jews. Now, if you don't know, I used to be a neo-Nazi from the age of about 16 to only a few years ago. Now, I used to follow the scriptures of the Nazis, which is anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, blaming everything on the Jews for the world's problems. It's very easy to do, it's very easy to get sucked into.
Well, another issue that's likely to come up today is one that we heard remarked on yesterday, the issue of a meeting that Andrew Hastie supposedly had with a far-right extremist. Now this man, Neil Erickson, is claiming that he had a secret meeting with two West Australian Liberals, Andrew Hastie and Ian Goodenough, at a Perth rally last year that was supporting South African white farmers. Now, he says that he met with this man in secret, but that has been contradicted. Andrew Hastie himself says he never met with this man. He's confident that he didn't meet him at this rally. But Ian Goodenough, his colleague, has contradicted that, saying that he believes he did meet with Mr Erickson, who is a member of the United Patriots Front, but just briefly at a rally for 2 or 3 minutes. Now, he does say that at the time he didn't recognise the man. It has since been pointed out to him by members of his staff. So the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is likely to face more questions about this on the campaign trail today.
What's that? Look.
Yeah, Jim, listen, this is for the documentary. Can you possibly remember back and tell me how many members of National Action were jailed?
There were actually 4. Myself, on the load-up offence. The 2 witnesses, one received a sentence of periodic detention and the other received a sentence initially of 2 years imprisonment, which he fought on appeal and reduced it to 12 months, obviously for services rendered. And there was another man who was imprisoned for 3 months on an offence called violent disorder, which is a street-based offence.
Right, so you 4 all up?
4 all up, but there were another 14 or 15 arrests on various charges of street offences, malicious damage matters and so on. Most of it resulted in minor penalties.
How many of them did you rat out?
0. And the important point is that the attack that was made on National Action, it was my co-accused in the Fundi crime who was falsely accused of being an informant. And as I experienced with him personally and all the way through to the end, all the documents I've uncovered from ASIO, Special Branch and others, it was clear that he was rock solid with me against the Special Branch provocation.
Well, these accusations were actually made by Neil Erickson a few years ago in a video he posted where he went through a panoply of, white-leaning groups such as Nationalist Alternative and Right-Wing Resistance, etc., and he said that you pretty much ratted out everybody in NA.
I
Now,
obviously didn't benefit from my treason, clearly. The only people who ever benefited were Special Branch, and ditto with my friend who was charged with me, Wayne Smith. He never gained any benefit from his alleged thing either. In fact, it was a game engaged in by Special Branch to falsely accuse him all the way along of being an informant.
what I'm interested in here is, of course, the allegations by Erickson were completely groundless. What would you say his motive was?
I think it's always designed with Neil to cover over his own activities. And of course, the National Action affair is now over 30 years old, and it's very easy for a professional spiv and liar such as Erickson to attempt to invent history from long ago. But as I'm now finding through my own researches, the activities of these people, they will never be able to revise falsely the history of nationalist organisations again. The documentary evidence shows who was who and what was what.
Now, but you actually gave him some assistance when he was facing court over the harassment and stalking, the phone harassment of that Rabbi David Gutnick, didn't you?
Yeah, look, I met Neil with the support of the Nationalist Alternative people. Remember, he was only a supporter of their group, not a member. But I spoke with him. He admitted his offence. He said that he had been drunk and a number of things at the time, that he was depressed, that he had a certain bad home relationship with a partner, I think it was. And I indicated certain things to him that were all correct and proper according to law, and he thanked me for that. And I find it quite entertaining a long time later that he then recoils directly on me.
But you'd also met with him and made a video during that heady patriot phase. I think it was in 2015, wasn't it?
Yes, and Neil, on that occasion, I conferred with many of his former associates, and they said, look, he seems to be doing the right thing here, despite our reservations. And those reservations were quite serious ones, and I had them too. But Neil insisted that the support of Australia First for this demonstration by these reactionaries was important, because it might mean that the group might not slide in the conservative direction, which it had already taken to doing. I did it on that basis, and that was it. But of course, neither any commentary made by me or any alleged good intention by Neil Erickson could stop that movement being a reactionary movement, and that's exactly what it was. Diversity minus Islam is not a formula to resurrect Australian identity.
Right, but would you? There was a talk that following his arrest over the Gutnick thing, that he may have actually been turned and become an informer. Now, what's your thoughts on that? And bearing in mind his activities in between, and that's quite a few years, and he seems to be still going strong. Have you got an opinion on that?
Yes, it was widely discussed in various circles that that may be so, including his former associates, members of Australia First and so on. There's an old saying from the American FBI that an arrest is gold, and he escaped the Gutnick affair with a very light rap over the knuckles. It therefore seemed that he had been very accommodating. A lot of evidence has built up since that time, and many people now say that he is indeed some sort of security asset.
Jim, thanks.
Seriously. All about bashing. I've got spies in his actual office.
Not at Tempe. Oh, for fuck's sake.
For fuck's sake, yeah. And I've got people in the Liberal Party, and I've got people in the Labor Party. But at the end of the day, if we want to do something when the sling goes up to Lindsay and he leaves his car park somewhere, you know, at Bertie's house.
Bertie's driving.
A little white Ford Escort sports sort of thing. It's like a little Ford, little white.
We can park it round where the bunkers are.
Yeah, it's inside the garage at the back.
Oh, there is a garage in the back. I didn't realise that.
Yeah, there's a roller door at the back of it.
Okay, so
if they want to cause him grief, get our guys and just
get into these locks and shit like that.
Guard over his door.
A couple of fucking potatoes up the exhaust pipe.
Yeah, if they want to do something, but don't get themselves to the point. If they're going to do anything,
part of the alliance, not the alternative. You know the difference. Yeah. The alternative violent. Yeah. I'm not into that shit. I'm too old.
If they're going to defeat his place, don't get there with doing a swastika. Make stencils, right?
Yeah.
Make stencils.
And then multiples.
Have some respect, which I do. No total, 60 seconds.
No, go.
Go.
Yeah.
60 seconds.
Come back and see the eggs do it again.
And, mate,
You're an adult's head.
Yeah.
They're good in the start.
Well, this is the night of our launch, the Pauline Hanson One Nation launch. All my candidates, what a wonderful night. Yes, we had some protesters outside. Yes, they were in the room trying to disrupt the meeting. And what was so stupid about it, they're calling racism, they're saying, you know, stop the freedom of speech. And that's the whole point. Pauline Hanson One Nation is all about freedom of speech. And here I have these two lovely girls with me, Rose and Googie or Grace? Which one? Googie or Grace? Don't care. You answer anything. But you know what? It's come out of tonight's meeting. These two girls were here. Gorgeous girls. And what's our message to the rest of the world? You don't have to be white to be Australian.
Pauline, does Centrelink have to get tougher on those who just refuse to work or accept a job and then just don't turn up?
Definitely they have to get tougher cost you, of course, but it comes down from the top. So at the very top is the Prime Minister, and then you have the ministers responsible for these portfolios. We have people ripping off the system. They're going to tourist areas, Byron Bay, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, purely because they know they won't need to get a job, or other areas. Unless we actually clamp down on this, by the year 2019-2020, we will be paying out approximately $191 billion a year in welfare payments. We can't afford it. Now, I've actually agreed with the government, once kids come out of school, finish school, that they have to wait a period. The government wants 1 month, I believe 3 months. Well, Nick Xenophon won't support it, and Darren can speak for himself, but I don't think he supports it either. Unless we put out this attitude, no, you can't go on to welfare, or you are only allowed on welfare for 2 years, then you have to be off it for 6 months. Or if you go to an area where there's no jobs there, you won't get welfare. We have to get tough and put the money where we need to put it, where I'd like to put it in legal aid or family law and dealing with those matters. I have a lot of respect for Gina. I think she's a great businesswoman, and I think she will do wonders. I trust the information that I have received.
My immigration policy never ever said to stop Asian immigration.
You went against Asian immigration?
No, I didn't.
My God, there's like...
No, I didn't.
You know there were cameras back then.
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. I was not against Asian immigrations, and actually, I had an Asian girl who was a refugee from Laos, manager in my shop.
Pauline, it's good to catch up with you again after all these years.
Yeah, I think it is great too, and I really appreciate you coming to my office and saying hello and welcoming me to the Parliament, and we've had a bit of a chat and we've had a cup of coffee, and it's great, and I really do appreciate that, Tony.
And Pauline, there are 500,000 people who've
tickling and a lot of slap. Then you talk a lot of love and crap. I'm just gonna take a little nap, cause this girl just wants to hate. What she wants to smoke my drugs, my cigarettes. It's being seen with me that she regrets, but she always gets what she gets, cause this girl just wants to hate. I just wanna play around with you, then I'll kick you off like a pair of shoes. Babe, I'm sorry, it's my nature, I can't choose, cause you're the girl and I wanna hate. Spend the weekend somewhere sunny, well, soaking up the rays while she soaks up my money. Never share the same idea of funny, cause this girl just wants to hate. Girl that thinks she's one of the blokes, girl that laughs at all her own jokes. She won't be laughing when she starts to choke, cause this girl just wants to hate. I just wanna play around with you, then I'll kick you off like a pair of shoes. Babe, I'm sorry, it's my nature, I can't choose, cause you're the girl and I wanna hate. I made just to break. Well, Ben's on display, there to take. Excitement, something she can only fake, cause this girl just wants to hate. When we make love, it's done with disdain. Gallons of alcohol and lots of cocaine. Then we spit on each other, then we do it again, cause this girl just wants to hate. I just wanna play around with you, then I'll kick you off like a pair of shoes. Babe, I'm sorry, it's my nature, I can't choose, 'cause I'm the boy and I wanna hate.
What stood out for me back then and what still stands out now is the phrase, no Allah in Allah. For those riots to happen when they did, when I was just on the cusp of, entering into my adult life, really transformed the way that I thought of myself as an Australian.
The New South Wales Supreme Court has ruled a rally to mark 10 years since race riots in Sydney's Cronulla suburb cannot go ahead. Police had sought an injunction against Saturday's planned gathering, arguing that it could stir tensions. The far-right organisers of the rally were billing it as a memorial. Organiser Nick Folkes, leader of the Anti-Islam Party for Freedom, said the decision was an attack on free speech but that he would not stage the event. Mr. Folkes told the court he would submit the unjust request to cancel the event and use the party's Facebook page to say it was not taking place. He also agreed not to address any public gathering that did occur. The court said he could face jail or seizure of his property if he disobeyed the order. Mr. Folkes said instead, he would hold a hole-free barbecue. The party's Facebook page is advertising the event as taking place in the same site as the cancelled rally.
I'd just like to say that both courts, Supreme and Federal Courts, have made the decision that we can't proceed. So both injunctions have been granted, and it's unfortunate, but I have to comply with both federal and Supreme Court orders. Let's fight for another day, and I don't want to sort of break the law, because if I do go down there and I do speak and the public assembly is held, then I'm in contempt of court, and I was warned that I could possibly lose my house,
Mass rally held on that day, and we all know that there were some so-called violent incidents. We also know that after December 11, there are even more violent incidents, in fact much less spontaneous violent incidents, very, very well organised ones that have also had a deleterious effect on Sydney's ethnic relations, but I'll come to that down the track. We know from most reports, and I suppose most journalists who still have some honesty in them, that there was a long lead up to what happened on the December 11 down there at Cronulla. We know that there were years of racial harassment of Australians in the beach suburbs. We know that there were a litany of sexual assaults that took place in Sydney in the years 2000 to 2002. We know that there was finally an incident where some Australian lifesavers were brutally bashed several days before the incident at Cronulla on December 11. And we know that there was a lead up through the public media of text messaging and so forth calling people down there that day. However, if we were to believe that this is simply something that's come in many ways out of the sky, I think we'd be very, very wrong. Some of the confidential type people in the multi-culti industry, people such as Professor Mary Calancis and Mr. Castles and Mr. Cope and many of the others who write the books with amazing titles like Community Without Nation, Beyond Nationality and so on. These people say that what took place was in fact an earthquake, and it had been brewing for a long time. This is what they say. It was fortunate for me that I actually witnessed the event. I went there. When I arrived in the general area, what I saw was, to use an old phrase from the 19th century, a festival of the oppressed. There was something in the vicinity of 5,000 to 7,000 persons in the general beach area of Cronulla, and I saw women and children and more young girls than I've ever seen anywhere in one place in all my life. I saw an area be decked out in the Australian national flag, the famous blue flag of Eureka, the boxing kangaroo flag. I saw people dressed in all sorts of bunting. I saw people caped in national flags. I even saw a bloke dressed as Ned Kelly. What I saw in the early phase of that day was simply a festival. I would also put to you that not since the time of 1966, if we go back to 1966 when the famous White Australia policy was abandoned, I would use the term betrayed, there has never, ever, ever been a crowd like this. There have been demonstrations, there have been strikes, there have been all sorts of political parties which have questioned the pattern of Australia's immigration and multicultural policy. But there has never been a crowd turned out in a single place on an issue like this. After the so-called riot phase that took place at about 2 o'clock, and you've all seen certain photos and all that on TV, I need not belabour it, one very, very significant fact occurred to me, that this was the first time also since 1966 that the Australian people were masters of their own streets, because all serious political politics begins in the street. I was interviewed a little later in the afternoon, I think about 20 to 3, by a lady from 2GB. And already a number of the things that occurred to me, because I took a notebook and I wrote down everything I could. I come to the conclusion, folks, that a line would soon emerge. I actually wrote down that the line would be that alcohol had been a problem. Now, there were some people with tinnies, I saw that. There were some blokes with slabs of beer under their arm, I saw that too. There were some bottles thrown, I saw that too. But what I did not see is 5,000 drunks. I did not see that. It did not happen. But it occurred to me that the media would say that it did. It also occurred to me that they would say that people had come from other areas in Sydney to be louts and troublemakers. And it also occurred to me that they would start talking about outside extremists or whatnot who had come down there to incite the crowd. Now, bear in mind, the police videoed all of this. We know that. If anyone had been making provocative speeches or inciting crowds or giving out alcohol, the coppers would have caught it. Didn't happen. Some of the events there, the so-called violent phase, were spontaneous events. And that interview was aired at about 4 o'clock. Come the next day, sure enough, the line had begun to emerge. Lie one that's been pursued by the media was this, that all of the events that took place there were the products of alcohol. And we've heard that repeated over and over and over again, that it was all the fact that the boys were drunk and they got carried away and they did things. But as I said to you, 5,000 people weren't drunk. On the Today program, Tracy Grimshaw, from recollection, it's a rather confused sequence, said that either I personally or guys from the Australia First Party, whatever, actually distributed alcohol. Now, if you had done that, that would also not only be a breach of their alcohol laws, but it would be an offence in the overall context of things. Or as one wag said, you would have had to have a bloody big truck. But there's no film of that either. Lie number 2 is that all this was somehow or other instigated by outsiders. Well, that one's never really washed too much. They concentrated on, Westie blokes coming in from Parramatta and Blacktown and, the young thugs and all that. They wanted to go down there and cause some trouble. But it's fairly clear that the vast majority of people at Cronulla that day were locals. But there were a lot of blokes who came from other areas, that's certainly true. The real event at issue really was, it wasn't simply a protest of the people in Cronulla, it was a protest of anyone who was Australian who lived in Sydney who was welcome to come. And that seemed to be the import of what was being said in the lead up to it, even by certain radio shock jocks. Basically, therefore, it was a mass demonstration. Lie number 3 was consistently developed by the media over time. They said that it was all something to do with white supremacists. Now, this story arose very quickly. It's been peddled very widely. I didn't see them there either. I actually looked. I looked to see whether or not there was anyone who really looked out of place. And I must admit, in the whole time, I think I saw one bloke who you'd classify as a skinhead, right? 1 in 5,000, 1 in 7,000. Forget it. I also thought that the term white supremacist was actually a term that related to the Democratic Party in the United States in the years 1865 to about 1875 and had something to do with the so-called Reconstruction period in the states, the former states of the Confederacy, but apparently the meaning of the term has now changed, and it's something that's trotted out from the media to concern anyone who protests over any issue of race in Australia. I was also called one. I went back over my particular writings. I can't seem to find anything that particularly justifies the label, but that's what they say. Lie number 4 was that it had something to do with neo-Nazis. Now, I remember I spoke here at this forum 5 years ago about those guys. I looked for the 10 or 12 mental midgets who make up that fraternity, and I didn't see them at Cronulla either. Although, I'm reliably told by several journalists they were everywhere. Well, neither I nor many comrades of mine saw them, and the best impress is that they were not there at all. These lies were summed together a few days later at a meeting at the Surf Lifesaving Club, all conveniently organised by the local mayor, the ex-Liberal Mr Schreiber and many others, with representatives of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation in attendance. They got seen driving off in their protective services vehicle, one dressed as a surfie, one dressed casual and one dressed like me, sort of like May, Larry and Shem. But they were there. And an apology was written and signed by the surf guys, written in this amazing government ease, saying that it was all the product of alcohol, outsiders and racist extremists who invaded their turf on this particular day to perpetrate actions. I better don't drop the comma and put the semicolon. Most of the surf guys don't write that way. In fact, it was written by ASIO, almost certainly. In other words, they simply invented a marketable lie. This lie was exposed, and several days later they actually admitted that, yeah, we'd been there. I'd take it further, they wrote the apology. Why would you bother writing an apology of this sort? Well, there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason is that the brief of communal violence is part of the brief of the secret police, and they don't want this thing they call communal violence. And they're particularly worried that any number, and there were thousands of them, remember what I said, folks, this was a radical crowd. There has never been a crowd like this turned out on the issue of immigration and multiculturalism before, ever in our country. The secret police were concerned, are concerned, that any number of people who were there, the families, the people themselves, may become voters, supporters, activists, so on and so forth for political movements. You mustn't have that. Not at all. Australia's future is being set as part of the Pacific Economic Order. You must not have an identity protest in Australia. The second lie is an interesting one. As you know, the secret police have been training for years to combat this thing called Muslim terrorism. Supposedly, you know, secret cells of mad mullahs who turn up and they train a few people in their religious schools and they create a violence network, and they plan to drive an aeroplane into you know, the Summit restaurant one night when you're all there. This sort of stuff is the model that they put up to combat terror. But what they saw in the 3 or 4 days after the Cronulla riot was something different. They saw hundreds of alienated, deracinated, deculturated, criminal men, many of whom, by the way, have been signed up by the Australian Labor Party as members in the branch stacks in Bankstown and Lakemba and Belmore and so forth. These young men, totally alienated from an Australian society into which they do not fit and never will fit and always hate, become marketably available for small cells of men of violence in Australia. They never expected that this might be the type of terrorist who they would have to fight. So they come out with this cumbersome lie that the Aussie boys were drunk, as if that's going to send them home. It's an act of imbecility. What actually took place at Cronulla, I coined the term, and I believe it was taken up by a couple of journos, was actually a civil uprising. Australia has had several civil uprisings, and all political change, wherever it is, and I take issue with some of your speakers here, does not come from lobbying or whatever. It comes from mass action. The great changes of democracy in Australia resulted from the Eureka Stockade. The great changes on immigration began at Lambing Flat, and the great achievements in a social legislation began at Barcaldine in Queensland. What took place at Cronulla was a civil uprising. It's had a number of results, massive political results. We have seen in this state at least the full expose of political policing. We have seen that not only are our police being compelled to, but at the hierarchy, quite happy to be so, weak on prosecuting various types of people for social and racial and other types of crime. But we have actually seen in the hierarchy of the police force a totally myopic, narrow view in the prosecutions of the people responsible for the so-called violence at Cronulla. We all know the stories, suppressed video material of certain immigrant groups who've done dire violence, lies about whether they can trace these men or not. But what we do see is the stigmatisation of a number of Australians who may well have broken the law. We accept that. They may have done criminal acts. It's not really the point. But we see a total focus on getting every single last one of these guys prosecuted. Why would you want to do that? If not to curry favour with certain minorities and to intimidate the Australian community. We've also seen the total weakness of the multicultural and multiracial doctrine. There is no community here. There is not even a community to divide. It's already divided, and it's only united by capitalism. It's only united by the fact that they all participate in the marketplace. What we do see is deep and deepening divisions between some of the intrusive groups. We also see right now violence dished out by Arab and Muslim groups towards Tongan Christians and South Sea Island Christians and Sudanese animists and so on and so forth. What we actually see is that the society, the mythic society that was to be created, is also itself coming apart at the seams. As I said to you before, the power of mass action was demonstrated on this point. What does disturb me, and I think it's a very important point to disturb, is this. I was interviewed last week by the St George and Sutherland Shire leader, and I gave these words, that while I cannot say to you that no person should not nominate his son, his daughter or his mate to the police for participating in these illegal incidents, if I said that, that would itself be a crime. But what I can say to you is anyone who did that would suffer from a very, very low case of moral self-esteem. That I did say. What we have seen, however, is many people, because illegal actions were committed, the bourgeois, the wiseacre, what does he do? He runs away. He wouldn't have done that, would he? He wouldn't have broken the law. He wouldn't have stepped outside of convention. Well, I know I didn't that day. Right? Some young men did, we know that. But what we see is that all of these people are simply to be abandoned to their fate, abandoned to the courts, abandoned to the false charge, according to a good friend of mine, a senior counsel, of a fray that can get you locked up for 10 years. What we see is no political defence of the men who may well have broken the criminal law. But the point is not the breaking of the criminal law. The point is, why did they break the criminal law? They broke the criminal law because of years and years of inaction and frustration at the refusal of the authorities to do what theoretically they should do, and now the misattention of the authorities to prosecute them and let other groups go. When that happens, ladies and gentlemen, there is no law. That is political prosecution, and these men should be politically defended. But by and large, a lot of people who call themselves patriots don't want to do that, because what that means is they are associating themselves with someone who broke the criminal law. Whoopie-doo. We even have a parliamentary seat called Layla, named after Peter Layla. He broke the criminal law too. There is a great attempt to restrain and contain the upsurge. We've seen that the multicultural industry has come from everywhere. There are projects and touchy-feely things all over the Sutherland Shire, and they're spending $50,000 down there on a school education program. But what did Four Corners tell you last week? It could all happen again. It could all happen again so easily, because there is no unity in the false society that has in fact been created. We know that none of these groups, the intrusive groups, have any particular feelings for each other, and certainly do we really believe that because of some policing and patrolling the beach areas that the hatred, these fundamental hatreds of the intrusive groups for the native Australian has gone away? No, I don't think so. The moment the police go, the thugs will return. That's a fact. And if they can't return there, they'll simply return somewhere else. It's endemic. It's become a social, logical problem. It will not go away. We've also seen, as I said before in the media, a decisive campaign to stigmatise these youth and anyone who defends them or anyone else as a racist and a white supremacist and a drunkard and a no good, and they've dragged out a few kids to say how sorry they are for what they did and they parade them. It's almost like a Stalinist show trial where people get up and confess their moral sins in front of everybody else. That's the circus that's being run by the Australian establishment. I think there needs also to be, parenthetically, a lot more unity amongst patriotic people. I won't name the group, I won't say a word, but I will say that one patriotic group banned me personally from coming to any more of their functions in New South Wales. Possibly it was because I defended these men, I don't know. But I hope to work that out and I'd like that rescinded. There is in Australia right now a new politics that's arisen post-Cronulla of race and identity. The fact of the matter is that the Liberal Party, as we know, has begun to produce a very interesting wishy-washy type of pseudo-patriotism that says that anyone in Australia can be Australian if they accept what they call Australian values. John Howard has said that, and Peter Costello went even further. He spoke there a couple of weeks ago at the Sydney Institute run by Dr Gerard Henderson, a creature who works for the Sydney Morning Herald. They have shares in his so-called Sydney Institute and so on and so forth. But the Sydney Institute is also, interestingly, they want the Muslims to have Australian values. They want them to conform to the marketplace. They want them to accept tolerance. But what is the Sydney Institute famous for? Full, total and complete support for Israeli state policy. Interesting, isn't it? A bit of a funny one there. We've also seen the Liberal Party, John Howard personally, running a scam on immigration back in 1988. It was a good one. He said that he was deeply concerned. He put up a thing called the One Australia idea. Deeply concerned, he said, about the pace of immigration to Australia from Asia. He didn't say he was against immigration to Australia from Asia. He said he was merely concerned with the pace. But the way the media ran it is a lot of people out here who were very worried about whether Australia is eventually going to be absorbed into a Southeast Asian trade zone might have assumed that John Howard was talking to them, was saying something to them. And some speaker before raised the matter of the kids overboard affair. We all remember that one. We decide, said the Prime Minister, who comes to Australia and how they get here. But just about every one of those people off the Tempe is now here. So he decided, didn't he? And now we see the latest scam. They're saying that they want these nice Muslim folks to conform to what they call Australian values. But which values? Your values? Or the people who Professor Fraser talked about last night, the professional managerial class values? Which values? Ours or the ruling class? Well, I don't think it's my values. I think it's their values. In fact, I think they're going to have a little trouble teaching the Muslims to be tolerant of the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras. On that point, I agree with them, right? Mrs. Hanson, whatever else may be said for her, said recently that she thought that Mr. Howard, Mr. Costello had listened to her. Well, I'd be a cynic here and say, yeah, they did, and then they decided to scam you. And what they're running now, if you like, is their own version of the vision of Australia. I have here a magazine cover of a government-produced magazine put out for Australia Day. And this magazine cover, I don't know if you folks can properly see it, but you see an African child and an Arab child and a Chinese type child, I think a child from Central Asia somewhere, and a child of European origin, and for the purpose, and only for this purpose I'll use this phrase, wrapped up in a piece of cloth and called Australian. Okay. This is a very interesting line. Now, according to some people who talk very, very much, and this is something that, in my view, has arisen directly out of the Cronulla affair and is now being talked at very widely in multicultural circles and television and talkback and so on and so forth, there are two competing visions, if you like, of what it is those who object to immigration and multiculturalism are talking about. The government's line, I suppose, is that we wrap everybody up in a piece of cloth and we say that they all speak English and we say that they all do some particular thing and swear some oath, and this makes them an Australian. I regret to say that there are some people who call themselves Australian patriots who also say the same thing. Unfortunately, it's either one or the other. You heard the phrase last night from Professor Fraser that being a member of a nationality was a matter of community, language and blood. That was the view of the men who saw your nation born. You could not necessarily be an Australian. There were many qualifications, and even, yes, there were some exceptions by citizenship and so on, we know that, some quite interesting and significant exceptions. But there was a 99.9% rule was that to be an Australian you had to be a person of European descent. You can't really have an identity in Australia if it is one that can be changed by an act of citizenship. This is a matter that is now simmering away, that has arisen precisely out of the issues of Cronulla. Who is an Australian and what is an Australian? You have two choices. Either an Australian is anyone who arrives here, wraps himself up in a piece of cloth and swears an oath, or an Australian is a person descended, if you like, by blood, by ancestry, from those people who are of European origin. It's a very, very hard choice. And there are many people who may call themselves patriots today who tomorrow I and any number of you may call enemy, because it is something that must be defined. Right now across Australia this issue will be defined. It will be defined for you. The matters in Cronulla do not come in isolation. They come as part of a process. Right now immigration is linked to the stain of contract labour and cheap labour and displacement. From the Sudanese folks in Newcastle and Coffs Harbour and Warrnambool and Toowoomba, through to Arabs and Muslim people in Kilcoy and Shepparton and Dubbo and Griffith and Young, to Vietnamese contract workers recently slotted into Charleville, and I believe also in Albany in Western Australia, and a new scheme that's being operated in Murray Bridge in South Australia. I'm not sure who's operating that. The ordinary Australian working man is going to be attacked. They have stripped you of your unions under the guise that they're all run by red idiots. They've stripped you of your workplace rules, and now they're going to strip you of your job because they'll find someone to do it cheaper than you will. Everything that your forefathers built will be taken from you. So the very hard issue of who is an Australian will in part be decided for you in the struggle that is now beginning in our country, not just for our identity survival, but even for our personal survival. Now some people might say to me, or to people like me, or something like that, well, why would you go to certain places where, you know, there might be contract labour or asylum seekers or other similar people there, and why would you want to go and agitate or cause trouble or so forth, or be seen in some negative way or something like that? Why would you want to do that? Well, I believe, my fellow Australians, that there is a very, very positive lesson that does come out of all of the ups and downs and rights and wrongs of Cronulla. And I'll say it to you in a single sentence. It is my heartfelt belief that it is about time the white Australian agitates back. Thank you. Comedy reviews. His comedy reviews a lot? It's more the way he perceives his political opponents, and I think that he perceives me in a particular way. It's somewhat wrong, but that's... I think he perceives me as something of a fucking Nazi comedy. He's pretty wrong, you know. But anyway, that's cool, man. Have a good afternoon, John. Bye-bye.
So, what is the advantages of having this this headquarters?
Well,
this humble headquarters.
Australian nationalism in a world city like Sydney needs an office. It needs some sort of organisational focal point. Had that never existed, both the offices, the meeting facility and other services, we could never have organised. And that's the bottom line of it. And secondly, had we attempted to organise, certain structures and groups of people who were, I'll say, fake patriots of one form or another, would technically have been as good as us, as they like to claim. In fact they are, and they're not. So by us having such a facility, we stamp part of our mark on what Australian nationalism should be, and we do.
And you share it with a cat? Or rather,
a cat shares it with me. We know that, rightly or wrongly, our country's got a lot of, very liberally minded people in it. And certainly I've never been a fan of the concept of foreign aid. In fact, a lot of foreign aid has gone down the drain, it's been horribly wasted, it serves no purpose. And we have tens of thousands of Australians who are in fact internal refugees in our own country, suffering in various ways from the fact that money is just arbitrarily wasted. But if in fact you are at war, and if there is actually an international problem with this terrorism, then why doesn't the foreign aid go to the resettling of these people back in the countries that our governments have wrecked and help to rebuild them? That would be a little bit more logical. In fact, it might even do you a favour down the track, because you'll never have to go to war over there again. It'll all be gone. Your sons and daughters will still be alive. It's also proper to say no to refugees. And I believe in the current climate, a lot of these so-called refugees that are being brought here, it's a political hot potato, particularly with the advocates who bring them here, and also with these so-called refugees themselves. Putting aside the fact a lot of these Syrian refugees are not Syrians, obviously so, but let's take it that some are Syrian. I think it's very important that there's a public campaign that tells these folk it is safe simply to go home. That you have been brought here on the basis of a trick and a fraud. In fact, I would say to you, a lot of these people don't even know where this war came from and how it's actually happened.
So you spend a lot of time texting.
Yeah, unfortunately so.
And taking care of business, always strict with the finances.
Well, yes, unfortunately, because when people donate money, and last week we got a donation of $1,500, if you don't look after the finances well, people don't give you any more, do they?
The party does have reliable donors, doesn't it? Which has managed to help it survive for...
Yes, well, reliable donors come from people who've obviously been associated with nationalism for a long time, and they trust people inside the party to apply their money correctly. And that doesn't just mean myself, it means several other people. And we do our level best as an incorporated body and as a registered political party to look after those contributions and make sure that they're properly applied. There are no wages in Australia First. There's no special overheads in Australia First, and it's very rare that even monies are applied to our headquarters building for any reason, although from time to time security cameras, some cleaning, the party is paid for that. But there's certainly no overheads in this, and we like to keep it that way.
Well, Pauline Hanson wouldn't be happy here, would it? I mean, who'd pay for the designer shoes,
Well, look, there is that famous story that she walked out of a bank one day with Pauline's United Party, cashed a cheque for $202,000, and it's never been seen again. It's actually quite ironic that they jailed her for things that she'd never done back in the 1990s, and then an opportunity comes up to possibly chase the lady for something she has done, and they declined that too. I said many times it always comes down to state interest. Certainly in our case, we've never been investigated for financial irregularity, and we never will be. So there you go. Thanks. In this election for Lindsay, casting a vote for a so-called minor party is in fact a very useful vote. We also say to always preference your sitting member last. In this election, the policies that we are running on are that we don't wish the Lindsay area to become part of a global growth corridor, which means the undermining of Australian jobs and work conditions by what is in effect an alien enclave. We are opposed completely to the overdevelopment of the Penrith area, which would be essentially Chinese-dominated development. We also say that the transport industry in the Lindsay area needs to be protected against this development, so trucking firms will be forced off their rather large properties. We also say that the ice epidemic and the drug epidemic in this area needs to be treated by way of compulsory detoxification. Australia First view is always a nationalist one, and what Australia First is in its very name, Australia First. Thank you.
Parliament last year in support of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And a lot of this talk of growth and development and jobs in Western Sydney and everywhere else is all predicated upon an idea that there's going to be some enormous market boom that's going to link you folks out here in with a permanent boom that's going to take place in China. And in fact, I believe that they talk now of a thing called a global growth corridor. Does anyone even know what a global growth corridor is? I'll make a suggestion to you that it's the beginning of a thing called concessionalism, where you end up with a two-stream economy, an economy for the new masters, an economy for the tradies, the toilet cleaners, the janitors, a few building workers and other people. It's also about the sale of education overseas. You're talking about one of these at Parramatta, it will inevitably come here. What this is a very complex word. Some of you have heard it. It's called imperialism. It's about the rise of some new power that's making a grab. They talk about building jobs and building infrastructure. For whom? It's for people who haven't even arrived here yet.
Yes.
In fact, when they're finished building their global growth corridor here, a lot of the Aussie farms stretching all the way from Camden to Hawkesbury are going to disappear. And your eggs and your vegetables and all of this will have to come from far away. And the reason is that up and down the Nepean and Hawkesbury River, it'll be some new, I don't know, Dragon Boat City. It's unfortunate that we have to think about these political questions. The aim of Australia First is to bring these issues that are complex national questions down into a local government or federal government, but a local area contest. That's actually what it's about. There is no job future for you, but there is job future for the visa workers, there's job future for the cheap labour, there's job worker futures even for the refugees who they intend to bring from Syria and exploit. There's plenty of job future for that, but there ain't no job future for you unless you are a small crust of people along the top. And our submission is don't vote for either of the globalist parties. The two parties are the same on all of those questions of globalisation. They are the same. It is one system with two faces. Make a choice. In this election, I preferenced Ms Scott last. It makes no difference. In a seat in Victoria, we preference Labor last. The reason we regard them as the same. Thank you.
Is it an official picket or something, is it? No, it's not a union picket. We're just picketing Harvey Norman over the employment policy that we're going to have regarding refugees. And it's not only a dangerous policy, it's also highly discriminatory. And it's part of the government's attempt to impose a refugee policy without any form of real consultation or debate. And I hate to tell them this, but when President Assad wins the war, he wants them all to come home. So I don't know what Harvey Norman is up to, but we're having a friendly picket and we'll be picketing all throughout Australia.
I think he's just behind you there.
Yeah. So, I think he is, the man himself. All right.
I've got it going, so.
You're a legend in your own right.
Hello. Hello. Hey, Jerry.
Yeah.
How you going?
Yeah, wish you all the best, but you know.
Yeah, come inside in the shade for a minute.
Come inside in the shade in a moment. So we have your permission to enter private property.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can stay here all day.
Oh, look, we're only going to be here for a brief period of time. And,
okay, so I can see what you're on about. Okay. So I'll just tell you what my side is.
Just quickly, you're not recording there.
No.
Thank you.
So the government rang us, okay, and they said we're bringing in 12,000 Syrians.
Yeah.
So can you help us find jobs for them?
Yeah.
Now, what they haven't told anyone is that, and I'm not 100% sure of this, but it's about right. But I'm not guaranteeing this, but at least half of them are women and kids.
Oh, yeah.
So there's no jobs for them.
No, no.
So that's 6,000. And then 30% of them are women only.
Yeah.
Right? And then 20% are men. So there'd be 2,400 men.
Yeah.
So they'd be the ones that might want a job.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not 12,000 people that wanting a job, it might be 2,400.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming the government doesn't want to talk about it because I'd say the women and kids have lost their husbands or fathers, okay?
Yeah,
so they're dead.
Yeah.
So they're trying to not talk about that.
Yeah.
And I don't quite understand why, but I sort of. Right? So I think, you know, it's just the PR side of it. So you don't talk about that. So you're not talking about 12,000 people coming in and getting a job. Yeah. Okay? So they said to us, would you help us? Well, what do I say? Because if 12,000 coming in and 6,000 kids, they're going to go to school somewhere. And if 3,000 or 4,000 are women, they're going to be looking after those kids. So you're not talking about many people. Now they're coming regardless of whether you want them or not, or I want them. There's nothing to do with it. They're coming.
The thing is, how many ISIS people are amongst them, you know?
Oh, that's another matter. Sorry, Mr.
Going by what is happening in Istanbul at the Blue Mosque.
Yeah, so look,
10 people dead.
I have no idea. Okay,
No,
so
you're just explaining.
So from my point of view, I have no idea. If they're from ISIS or not, I don't know.
No.
You can pretty much guarantee most of the women and kids probably are not. Okay?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So, but there might be someone there from ISIS. But, and let's say there are some, which I wouldn't have a clue.
No.
But the bigger danger, I would have thought, from ISIS' point of view, is here where you have people that are trying to recruit people to their way of thinking. Right? So that's the biggest danger. But if
obviously, you want to know what we're doing, which is a fair question. Is that right? Okay. Well, look. Unfortunately, like you can appreciate, certainly we won't do anything that's illegal or improper or anything like that. I don't know if you've ever been picketed before for any reason.
No, I have been over the years a few times. But I haven't got an issue with your picketing.
No.
Because you've got a point of view and I haven't got the issue with your point of view.
Because, you know, with due respect to you, you're a very high profile person, everyone knows who you are.
Yep.
And the government has asked you to do this. We will probably turn up outside some stores in Melbourne, Mildura, Brisbane and Adelaide, and we'll simply say that the government's come forward with this policy and that they've put it to you, and that they've suggested that, you know, your stores employ, whereas we don't think anyone should. We think that the policy is completely flawed and faulty. In fact, I have some contacts with Syrian, I'll give you my card, Syrian political parties, and they argue that when the war is over, President Assad wants the people to return, and that should be the Australian government's policy. As you remember, we gave some sanctuary to people in the Bosnian War, and they camped them all in Western Australia, about 8,500 people. When the war was over, I think everyone returned to Bosnia except for one woman who was so ill that she couldn't be moved, and she died in Western Australia. So that's a fair compliment. If they brought some people and offered sanctuary at the moment, President Assad says that you can all return home. That's what we'll be saying. So we won't be saying anything to incite people against Harvey Norman stores or anything like that. We'll just be making the point that the government has imposed that policy. So you won't have any trouble from us.
They haven't asked us to do anything other than consider if you can see an employment. So let's just say you said, no, I won't employ them. Right? I mean, everyone said that. Then they'd be on social welfare. Right? And then if you put people that are you put people under stress, no matter what nationality they are, they can then be radicalised by other people.
That's also
you
true.
know. So, you know,
But maybe they should stay back home and fight for their country like we would
That's
do
another
here.
issue.
I don't necessarily disagree with you. Okay?
Yeah, that's another issue too.
But again, I'm not a part. I didn't bring them into the country.
No,
I have no more.
Absolutely, we know.
I have no more involvement in bringing them here than you have. All I know is that they're here, or coming. So, I have to be objective about it and say that if I don't employ them, someone has to. Because the alternative of not employing them is a lot worse than
Oh, look,
having them employed.
I understand your point of view that you're
You
caught
should be
between the rock
employing
and a
more
hard
Aussies
place.
that are out of work.
That's also true.
But hang on, we're doing that too. And let me say to you, we've got jobs out there going for people all the time. We can't fill the jobs. Okay. Now people talk about unemployment. Unemployment's 6%, and there are people out there that just won't work.
Oh yeah.
They won't work.
Yeah.
And you can employ them here. They come in, they say, yeah, no, I want a job, and then 3 days later they don't even turn up. You don't even see the buggers. Right?
My youngest son has been trying to get a job and he can't. Would you like to employ him?
Well,
Make an application.
Well, he can make an application, sure. No, but look, we've got ads out there all the time for people. But here's another thing. Say I employ a person and put them on our sales floor, whoever it might be. But they might not be capable of being able to deal with customers, and then you get complaints about that person all the time.
And you're saying the Syrians would be better at doing that?
No, they're not going on the sales floor. Right? And then if we employ any of those Syrians,
Are you in the warehouse or something like that?
well, it might be in a warehouse, it might be in a clerical
A lot of
position.
Aussies would like to work in the warehouse.
But let me
My
say,
son would be one. I think he'd be just glad to get a job.
but we might be able to give him a job. We've got plenty of jobs. Okay.
I'll make sure he rings you.
No, we'll just turn around our HR. There's no problem. He can come in here for an interview. So, but we have got no shortage of jobs. Like, we've got jobs out there, but there are certain people, if you put them on a showroom floor, they don't represent your company properly. You get complaints on them all the time, and you can't have them. You've got to have the right sort of people. And so, you know, if someone's in a warehouse and they pick the wrong product all the time and deliver it to the customer or something, we can't have them there. So you constantly need people that are capable in their job. If they're not, it comes back and bounces all over you.
With this little matter that we're going to be doing, you obviously have my number there.
Yeah.
That's an office home number. If there's any issue that arises, but we wouldn't expect there will be, because we don't intend to violate the integrity of the stores or anything. That's not what we do. We're
All
not
I can tell you is my side.
Yeah.
You can, if you put yourself in my position, you'd have to say, well, what would I do if I was that bloke?
Yeah, well, we have to behave very rationally ourselves. So there certainly won't be any issue
With those, you won't be employing a lot more Aussies.
We employ every nationality you can think of. I'd walk you through there and find a nationality that doesn't exist. And you've got to remember, every one of us came from somewhere. We're not Australians. The only Australians are the blackfellas.
No, I certainly am an Australian.
No.
I'm native to the soil.
Prior to 1788, they were just what you said.
You say you're an Australian, I say I am too.
The term Australian came from the British.
Who created the land of milk and honey?
Settled here. My people fought for this country through 2 world wars, Jerry.
And my grandfather's dead.
I've got a lot of my relatives dead too.
The thing that I object to, the thing that I object to, is that about 40 years ago,
See, I believe in self-betterment. You're trying to better yourself. I'm trying to better myself. And I see that these people are undermining our way of life. So, you know,
Anyway,
it's a difficult
let
thing.
me give you another girl that works for us now. She was a boat girl from Vietnam. She came here, and there were 2 brothers and her on the boat. The family left them. She told them to go on the boat. That was 28 years ago. She's now one of our best employees. And the other day I was just talking to her, and she said, you know, I've got a son 18 and a daughter 19, and they were talking to their grandmother, and the grandmother's a Vietnamese, and she said, you know,
You'd expect that.
Yeah, she said it would be wonderful if you two could marry a nice Vietnamese boy or a nice Vietnamese girl so I could talk to them. They didn't say anything. And then later on, when they got out in the car with their mother, they said, we're not going to marry Vietnamese. We live in Castle Hill. They don't know any Vietnamese. They don't even mix with them. Right? Now, they're born here, right? And they're Australians too, aren't they?
Well, I'd have to take an objection to that.
Would you say they're not Australian?
Well, they carry a passport.
No, hang on, they were born here, they're Vietnamese.
It doesn't matter, I could be born in a stable.
But you and I are no different. We were born here. We came from somewhere else.
No, we didn't.
We did.
We sprang, our nationality comes out of the Australian soil. And,
but we
that's who
came
we
from
are.
somewhere else, every one of us. We came from England or Ireland.
Yeah,
or
that's right.
Germany
And
or
that's
somewhere.
where the Australian culture was.
That's exactly right.
Our Aboriginal friends came from somewhere else too.
Yeah.
In fact, I think all of humanity has wandered around somewhere.
I
in its
agree
time.
with you, 100%. But
You know, it doesn't
so
make the origin of the Aboriginal race is India. It doesn't make them Indians, and you know, it's a twisted one. But with this refugee issue, I think it's fairly straightforward what the Australian government's doing, and I think that it's a policy that should be opposed. And they've done it because our Australian government is complicit in the war, which is another story too. Our government has been behind the scenes supporting ISIS and all these revolutionaries to bring down Assad. This is criminal stuff. Now they bring people to Australia and offer them refugee status. It's really hypocrisy in the nth degree.
Anyway, look,
Some of this stuff will come out.
I thought I'd come down and
No,
talk
look,
to you.
I'm very pleased you did, but I'd
You know.
like to reassure you there won't be any trouble at the stores, there won't be any harassment of staff, all that left-wing crap, we don't do that. Australia First, I'll leave you with something from left field tonight. A lot of people talked about immigration, security, human rights and various questions. And we've seen examples of terror and violence and all that lately in the world. We have to ask, where does this come from? Well, last night the Russian foreign minister actually caught the United States out supporting al-Nusra Front in Syria, which is Al-Qaeda. Right? And for many years now, the allies of the major parties have actually been funding and assisting the rise of this thing called ISIS. They don't so much do it now because the Russians have caught them out. Putin caught them out last year. But they were doing this, and they did it for a reason. They wanted to destroy the secular regime of President Assad because he didn't like Israel. And they wanted to destroy Assad. So they've cost the lives of 400,000 Syrians and stampeded millions of Syrians out of the country. Now, these folks over here want to give you some in Western Sydney and call it humanity. At a time when President Assad says he'll take them all home to rebuild Syria from the damage that the United States and its allies, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Israel have caused in Syria. Now, if I was going to vote for a major party, you know that the Prime Minister of Britain, the former one, Tony Blair, is likely to be prosecuted in Britain for war crimes. Why would you want to vote for a major party that's actually implicated in what is in fact one of the great war crimes of the 21st century, namely the inciting of the civil war in Syria for some bizarre reason, and then they lecture us or lecture me particularly on what human rights means. I thought I'd give you that one from left field because you have to think about this. People are talking about security questions. Where does it come from? It actually comes from the people who crawl on their bellies to the regime in Washington, New York, and follow them into these wars. And now they say that they're actually going to do a humanitarian thing and bring refugees here. And President Assad says, come home and rebuild the country that they've wrecked. These guys wrecked it. You wouldn't vote for them. We're at the Lambing Flat Folk Museum, where the great roller flag... cut that one.
Melbourne's Magistrates Court with Chris Shortis. And what's today all about, Chris?
Today will be a mention hearing. I guess the prosecution will obviously want to hear what we're going to plead to the charges, whether they be not guilty or guilty. We're obviously going to plead not guilty to these ridiculous charges, particularly second and the third and the fourth. We've made restitution in the context of the first charge, and the idea that you can be charged for racial vilification despite being no plaintiff is absolutely ridiculous, and it's an expression of the state's desire to effectively to bring in anti-blasphemy laws, and that is wrong constitutionally in this country.
So you're here at the court to support Chris Shorters,
I am indeed.
and it's just a hearing today?
Yes, it is, but it's one of Australia's great free speech cases.
Yep. Do you anticipate that, you know, there's going to be a lot revealed in the months to come?
Oh, definitely. I think that the DPP is going to struggle absolutely to, I'll say, manufacture a case here, because there just isn't one. And they're going to find themselves in a legal quagmire that's going to set major precedent. So good luck, blokes. You brought it on. You deal with it.
And have you got a statement for the Bendigo 3?
Yes, I am. Victory to the Bendigo 3.
This is illegal in this country, and we will fight those charges vigorously, and not only that, lawfully. And the state will find themselves in the crosshairs of the system they proclaim to uphold.
So we'll just
Good on you, Chris.
So your name is?
Christopher Shorters.
Okay, and Chris, what's your role with the sort of UPF military there?
I'm not involved with the UPF now, but I was one of the three that took part in that political stunt on October 4th, 2015.
And can I just ask why you thought it was necessary to behead the dummy like that?
Well, at the end of the day, we have a theology called Islam, which is incompatible with Western society. The biggest reason that it's incompatible with Western society, there is no separation of church and state when it comes to Islamic practice.
So how did you express that by chopping the head off the dummy?
Because it's quoted in the Quran. Remember your Lord inspired the angels, saying, give firmness to the believers, I am with you. I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, smite you above their necks and smite their fingertips off them. Okay? We're expressing our concerns that the bigger the Islamic population grows in this country, the more danger that Australian citizens will find themselves in. Now, am I saying that every Muslim is capable of this sort of thing? No. I'm merely attacking the theology of Islam because it's inherent violence towards non-believers. Quran chapter 5 verse 33 states, those who wage war against Allah and his messenger and spread mischief throughout the land, his punishment shall be execution, by crucifixion or cutting off the hands or feet from opposite sides.
Do you think you got your message across though by chopping the head off that dummy?
Yes, it was a dramatic, dramatised political statement showing the very practices that exist in Islamic countries today. That Saudi Arabia uses beheadings as capital punishment, and they actually behead more people through their judicial system, which is Sharia law, than ISIS, the Islamic State.
Do you think it's sad that people coming to the city this morning had to wage their way through your various groups, both the ones who were supporting you and your opponents? You get a job out of it though?
Yes, because at the end of the day, what's been forgotten in our great country is that I might not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend your right to say it. That is gone, okay? Unless you have a socialist progressive mantra, which is to do with LGBT rights, pro-refugees or pro-Muslim immigration, you're considered a Nazi, right? And the bottom line is that this should not happen in Australia. No one cares that I'm a white man and they offend Christianity all the time. And some of the things that are said about Christianity do hurt my feelings. But let me make it clear. The court of law is not a place for hurt feelings. So my shoulders are big enough and broad enough to cop what is artistic criticism regarding my Christian faith.
And Chris, how do you spell your surname?
Shorters is S-H-O-R-T-I-S.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a good day.
Good on you, Chris.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure that representatives of Australian political parties are here present to express their support. And it's a pleasure to invite to the microphone Dr Jim Saleam from the Australian First Party.
as a student of terrorism and the war in Syria, what has been despicable for me is the fact that for a very long time Australian media and Australian political organisations, generally speaking, sided with the terrorists. And they did this for a lot of reasons, and they looked forward to the destruction of the government of Syria led by President Assad. And from the point of view of myself and many other people in Australia, it's abundantly clear that it has been the government of Syria and the intervention of Russia in this war that has done the most to curtail terrorism. And I think all Australians need to unite to impress upon all Australian politicians and leaders that the real fight against terrorism is being carried on by Russia and not by Australia and our so-called allies in this thing. That is the despicable thing of this war, and the ambassador is probably dead because of support given to the terrorists by people who are called Australia's allies. Thank you.
Somebody said that.
Under parliamentary privilege by Mr Barilaro, who said that I was not fit, he said, to be in an Australian parliament because I was an extremist and I was a bigot. I was a number of other things. And there's a bloke who had his good mate there, Darryl Maguire, down in Wagga, who was corrupt as hell. But that doesn't mean very much at all. It's only if you step outside the lines of political correctness. I believe actually that the Cootamundra electorate is a remarkable one for a number of historical reasons. It's actually, in many ways, the cradle of the nation itself. You have the birthplace of Henry Lewison, who defined Australia and Australianity in the 19th century and early 20th century, and at Young, with the Great Landing Flood Uprising, you established a pattern for free labour in what was then the Commonwealth. So Cootamundra is a very, very special electorate. It's historically based, and it's about what Australia and Australia should be for Australians. In my view, Australia is now being globalised, and you have two equal parties of globalism. In reality, there is no fundamental difference between the Liberal National Party on the one hand and the Labor Party on the other.
No.
At the candidates' nights in the by-election, I used a phrase from the American political philosopher Noam Chomsky, and he said, the mark of unfreedom is when you argue more and more about less and less. And that is exactly what is happening in Australia today between the blocs of major political parties. If the opinion polls are true, there is likely to be a very large swing away from major political parties towards minority candidates, minority parties and so on. The best way you can have to enforce your democratic right, if you like, to be heard is to vote outside of the major political party blocs. Thank you.
Now, mate, give us an impression, give us a definition of Australian nationalism.
Australian nationalism is a historical movement. It's not something that's merely a sentiment, it's an idea. The modern Australian nationalists would argue that there are three essential components that run from the historical movement of the 1880s and 90s that began to peter out in the decade or so after Federation in full flood, that was then reborn in different ways and new ways through the Great War, and Percy Stevenson and the achievements of the Great Patriotic War against Japan. Now, the historical movement of nationalism is composed and must be composed of nativism, labourism and a literary radical nationalism. By that I mean that Australian nationalism had a nativist element to it because it had to. Australia and Australians are not transplanted Europeans, nor is our culture necessarily transplanted. I see we have an issue.
This happens all the time.
Of course it does. Australian nativists, nativism appears all the way through Australian writing, through Australian art, Australian culture and poetry. It was an attempt to work out what was unique about the Australian contribution to European civilisation on our own soil. So nativism, which we will talk about again in greater detail, is incredibly important. We are not transplanted anything. We may have heritage without a doubt. But the way we define ourselves as Australians is the key thing. Labourism was the product of being aware that Australia offered a social vision. Labourism was the way in which Australians articulated their relationship in society. It meant that Australians advocated a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, they advocated the social legislation, they advocated the union organisation, they advocated the cooperative organisation. All of these things were part of labourism. And of course, as we know, the Labourites were at the same time nativists to virtually a man, and they understood too, often, some of the higher issues that were raised by what's colloquially called the literary radical nationalists. These were the men and women who wrote down their feelings about what Australian identity was and why it was differentiated from some of the other European identities with which we're readily familiar, particularly, of course, the British one, because Australia began as a British colony. So those three things were part of the historical Australian nationalism. As I said, they flowed down to the 1930s when we meet the great Australian nationalist P.R. Stevenson, who understood what Australia and Australians were. He didn't need to be told, he simply understood. And Australia defended itself on that basis and by those reference points during the Great Patriotic War against Japan. So the Australian nationalist movement can't be understood outside of those parameters. Now, I'm sure there may well be people who think that it can. They might bring in all sorts of furphies or talk about loose kith and kin patriotism and so on, but that's not what the original Australian nationalism was, nor was it how it was applied. So Australian nationalism to us, to nationalists, is something that is the promise of what Australia should have become, as it would have become from the 19th century. It's unfinished business.
So what do you say to all these conservatives that call themselves nationalists that are now running around with the red ensign, and they're encompassing, they're to be found wherever there's, say, a conspiracy theory to be expressed, or
look, a lot of people
but they call themselves nationalists, and in fact they look at us and say no, that's wrong, and this is a trouble when there's the component of education missing from them.
Of course there is, and look, it's sometimes people have very worthy sentiments or very worthy impulses, and unfortunately there are those who believe that Australia was some sort of legalist construction. In other words, when Australia federated in 1901, there was some suggestion that perfect democracy was to be created here, that freedom was articulated in the Constitution, that the Founding Fathers intended what the Germans called a Rechtsstaat, a law state, a right state. This was nonsense, and the Red Ensign people, like some of the conservative people, believe that what's gone wrong in Australia is the idea that that great promise of civil and political rights implicit in our Constitution has been robbed from them by crooked politicians. Now, as a, I suppose, politician myself, I'm very happy that some people wish to contest elements of authority of the Australian state. That's absolutely marvellous. But there was no promise in our original Constitution of some sort of universal freedom. There was no suggestion that Australia may have murkily acquired full sovereignty in 1919 when Billy Hughes went to the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of this stuff is simply, in my view, a lost notion. They're looking for something that actually does not, in fact, exist. The Founding Fathers of Australia were of themselves very good men, but the British Empire, as Stevenson said, never intended at all that 6 colonies were going to become some independent nation that could contest with them. When Australia became a federation in 1901, we didn't have our own currency, we didn't have our own army or navy, we had no right whatsoever to conduct our own foreign policy. And if any foreign government wanted to contact the Australian government in Melbourne, it had to go through the British Foreign Office. So the constitution that came into being in 1901 is in reality merely the beginnings, the dim beginnings of the idea of nationhood. It was something that happened, a bump along the way.
That's right, and appointments too, even with the church. It couldn't be petitioned directly to Rome. It had to be done through the...
Well, that's the Catholic Church, but the British would do all that for you. In different ways, Australia stumbled over a long period of time towards a type of de facto legal sovereignty. The Red Ensign folk and many of the conservative folk are never sure how this happened or when it happened, even why it happened. They simply go with the idea that they have been denied their rights, and incidentally, yes, they have been denied their rights, but you won't get your rights, if that's the right term for it, by talking about Magna Carta and the Petition of Right that are supposedly lurking behind our Constitution. A lot of this is in fact nonsense.
But also they don't really know what they want. They always, and I've noticed this about them, get together, shake their fists and pretty much make a petition to government to grant them
their rights.
Their rights or something they wish for. And they don't understand that the government is the problem. The system is government system.
Unfortunately, Australians have often or usually been like they don't question where does this system come from. It grew out of the British imperial system, grew out of it, but then it was co-opted into other systems as time went on. And today, where it's part of a type of New World Order globalist system, but it's exercised in the same rules and the same format as power might have been seemingly exercised almost 100 years ago. From the point of view of the nationalists, it can only really be that to have an informed citizenry that actually does have rights, like the right to bear arms that a lot of these people talk about, you'll only really get that through some sort of national revolution that actually confers upon the population their rights because they took their rights. And that's a different concept. That was written into, in my submission, the original Australian nationalist movement. That was part of its psychology. The patriotic people who demand their rights, as I said, I'm very pleased that they do, but they're not realising that they don't live in a Rechtsstaat. They live in a false state, and in order to get their rights they actually have to, I suppose, de-recognise the system that up to now they've supported. If we fought the long struggle to create an independent Australia that really did confer upon its citizens their rights and their identity too, we wouldn't be running around with the Red Ensign, that's for sure. And I can't go any further than that.
Should Paul Menzies be considered a true patriot?
No, absolutely not. The Conservatives now, the so-called people who make up the Liberal Party, are the ones who are talking about new Conservative parties and so on. Revere this man. This is the bloke who gave us the picket fence and the Hills hoist and the Holden car and so on and so forth. But the thing that Menzies did was, or Menziesism did, it disintegrated the Australian identity as it came out of the Second World War. And the greatest act of disintegration, Menzies walked away from the greatest treason that occurred after the war in 1966, when Australia's traditional immigration policy, the so-called White Australia policy, was abandoned. Menzies knew it was coming. Menzies didn't want it on his watch. He didn't want to take the historical responsibility for it. He walked away. and straight after he left, the same people who grew up within this so-called conservative Australia, the ones who were his ministers and so on, they changed it. The ultimate proof of that is 10 years later, Menzies came forward to be the patron of an anti-immigration organisation. He realised what he had done. It was too late.
The interesting thing is that these practitioners of this excitative terror, these lone wolf gunmen and so on people, don't mobilise mass movements. They don't train counter forces. They don't create alternate militias. They don't also create any type of economic political program which you would have to have. These groups in America have stripped out of any form of American nationalism and reduced it only to a discussion of race. But even then, they don't see that to have a politics that does concern the survival of the European American, you must have a social, economic and political program. They don't have it. And there hasn't been one for many decades. This movement has become a racist movement.
Well, it's become a movement for people with a very short attention span.
Oh, very short attention span, and that's why they like excited of terror. You see, once you've done your big deed and you're waiting for the masses to rise, these nutters would have been better off turning their guns on themselves and shooting themselves, because they're going to be in prison for a long time waiting for something which, in the terms that they put out, will never come. Now, as I said, Lenin made it very clear, if you want to have, he's a communist and he's speaking openly as a communist, if you want to have a communist revolution, give up terrorism. And you must build a political movement that mobilises masses of people against the Tsar until such a time that you can rise against the Tsar. These people with their apocalypse and white riot now and white revolution now and are useless people. And at the end of the day, they may even be very brave people, one or two of them. Some of them are probably absolute moral cowards. One or two of them might actually be a very brave person. They threw their life away for no reason at all.
What do you think would happen if Aborigines took up that kind of...
well, they're in a position to cause dire chaos if they really wanted to.
How would the state react to that?
They'd find it very difficult, extremely difficult.
Our protest today is to call for the freedom of the Golden Dawn political prisoners in Greece. The leadership of the Golden Dawn Party has been falsely convicted for running a thing called a criminal organisation. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Golden Dawn leadership constituted a criminal organisation. In fact, the prosecutor in the Golden Dawn trial recommended to the court that the men be acquitted on that charge. The Greek court then went ahead and convicted the men of the charge of criminal organisation and jailed them for 13 years. It's an outrage. They've been in jail now for 1 year without the appeal papers and other papers being served on them by the Greek state. We demand the immediate release of the Golden Dawn political prisoners on bail, pending the outcome of their appeal in the Greek appellate court.
Just to the side, I was on record saying that that man, Tarrant, you look at how ideology works, and that man is led to running into a mosque with automatic weapons in Christchurch to kill unarmed worshippers. Certain things got him to that point where he decided to do that. Let's just assume for a moment that Tarrant was actually 50 grams more political, and he took his gun and he went into a lecture theatre at the University of Sydney on any fine day and shot to death 51 Chinese students. It might be possible to argue that he could bring Australia to the edge of almost war with China, which may or may not have incredible political effect. You look at where these white terrorists go and what these white action-laden men do, and it ends up being a total fizz. Now, as I'm on record saying, I'm certainly not advocating that Tarrant should have done that or whatever. I'm simply playing devil's advocate and saying, well, what if he'd actually done that?
But the Muslim terrorists too, as much as they...
Maybe they're reading from the same terror manual written by the same agency with the headquarters in West Virginia. Someone is priming these people. I can't believe people can be this stupid.
I mean, if you were a Muslim terrorist, what would you do?
I'd start learning how to set explosives. I'd start learning how to...
What would you blow up?
And, well, you'd think about what you'd blow up. You wouldn't be going down to a police headquarters in Parramatta and putting a knife through a Chinaman who happens to be a clerical worker at the police station. It bedevils me. What are they thinking? But more particularly, who put that thought in your head? If we look at Tarrant, who put those thoughts in his head? I want to know. And it's unanswered because Tarrant pleaded guilty.
What are you going to do to serve the justice of clearing your name over what history has recorded you at? Will you be satisfied to go away and let history remember you as the man that authorised the shooting of an ANC activist, whom I may just add, whose own character has never been ventured into?
No, there are some things that you never let go of, and it's not to do with anything that's purely personal. It's to do with everybody else who suffered through the process, including even people who were forced to be false witness. Now, I'm not a Christian man, but I know that the Bible says, the commandments say, thou shalt not bear false witness. And to me, as a principle of ethic, if someone bears false witness, if they are forced to do so, and I assume these guys were forced to do so,
these guys
meaning a couple of people who were dredged up as witnesses to say that I had done a particular...
And who served jail time.
And did serve penalty. But even so, they were let go on light penalties. It doesn't end.
You served a harsher penalty than the people that actually allegedly, not even allegedly, but the jury decided committed the crime.
4 years. And when you get people...
What did they serve?
Very little. One served 1 year and one served 18 months periodic detention.
And wasn't one being driven to periodic detention by one of those that actually was
Neville Island, the head of the special branch.
And Neville Island was the one...
Yep.
Well, explain it to our viewers because it's perverse.
Neville Island was found at the Royal Commission into the New South Wales.
But Neville Island was the investigating
officer. Neville Island was the man who used to drive Justice Yeldon, the perverted Supreme Court judge, who was flashing and molesting in public toilets home from the custody of the railway police without charge.
But he did that, but he also drove this other...
he drove one of the offenders to his periodic detention every Friday night. And
for how long?
For about 18 months, and he kept talking to him about the need to imprison Jim Saleam for this crime.
Had this offender ever commented outside the paradigm of...
No, but his mate did. And I won't say much more about that. I'll simply say that his co-offender...
Well, I think it hasn't enough time elapsed, and isn't it in the interests of people who you intend to establish your innocence in, that you do just that?
Well, I'd simply
Wouldn't they regard anything less as evasive?
No, I do understand that, but I'll simply say, from the point of view of evidence and information, that his co-offender has said elsewhere that I was not involved in this crime.
Why won't you mention the other stuff?
Because it's, at the moment, stuff that's likely to be reviewed through particular files and other things. And
why? Have you an action present?
Yes, I've got stuff going to open up ASIO files and other things like that.
Are you aiming to clear your name?
Yes, I am. And I do know, and one thing I can say from the original trial is that this particular offender, I'll give one incident for the edification of viewers. We were alone in the court, with the exception of a sheriff.
Who were we?
Myself and this witness.
And the witness was witness responsible to what?
He was one of the ones who said that I'd done the crime.
At the crime being?
Being the shooting of Eddie Fundi.
Oh, okay.
And we sat there, I was in the dock, he was in the witness box. There was a sheriff in the court and another officer. And he looked at me across the court and he went like that.
He gave you
a wink and a nod. And when the court resumed, he changed his evidence. Now, he didn't change it to say I was not guilty. He simply changed it to make out he was a complete idiot. And he kept doing that over and over and over again.
And this obfuscation of evidence worked in your favour.
Indeed it did.
And his wink was essentially communication
to me,
to you.
He did not intend to convict me, but he was probably terrified by the officer who was running the case.
So you think in the interim that he had been persuaded to take a particular stand and his own conscience intervened?
His own conscience intervened and he couldn't do it. He didn't want to do it. He knew that he was going to say that I was guilty, but he knew that he was going to make out that he was the biggest moron, the biggest idiot, the biggest liar, the biggest inconsistent.
Did he do that?
Yes, he did. He did it magnificently, and I'll just say this, I commend the man for doing it. I think he did my best.
Ever spoken to him since?
No, but he did his best to get me found not guilty, and you've got to understand that if a young person is absolutely trapped by the system, that's all he can do, and he did his best to get me found not guilty.
Do you
New message. New voice messages. Received today at 11:21 a.m.
Yes, look, the situation with Newtown detectives, etc., seems to be following the pattern, not only in your case, but the case of the assaults on the ex-anarchist leader who defected and other people. There's no real investigation. From what I understand, there may well be photographic evidence to compare this offender with photographs taken from former video cameraing in this area. But to this point, this has apparently not been done. So it's still all in the dark. It may well be the detectives on the case of fair dinkum, but I'd say there's some sort of blocking instruction coming from the higher up the chain. Thank you.
To return the call, press 0. To listen to this message, press 1. To save it and go on, press 2. To delete the message, press 3.
Three, four, a galaxy of junk for a terminal flu. I'm seeing the same hallucination as you. Have you seen a good doctor? Seen a good clown? I don't need you to bring me down. This decade is a worry. It's our moment and our time. It's a matter of conjecture, dependent on a sign. Should we try to be different? Or should we toe the line because tomorrow is here and it's thought of as a crime? A galaxy of junk for a terminal flu. I'm seeing the same hallucination matter of feeling. And if you can, if it's really worth feeling, it ain't worth being a man. Blog us online, lose us in the net, let some other sucker feel the regret. A galaxy of junk for a terminal flu. I've seen the same hallucination as you. Have you seen a good doctor? Seen a good clown? I don't need you to bring me down. I'm tired of competition, I just wanna be a man. And if you call that old-fashioned, the shit has hit the fan. And it kind of explains all the blank faces and the changing shape of the tail of dog chasers. A galaxy of junk for a terminal flu. I've seen the same hallucination as you. Have you seen a good doctor?